All right, moving over to employment considerations. Once you've got your company formed, you're going to think about who's doing the work for the company, how they are related to the company, how the company is absorbing the rights and properties that you want the company to own at the end of the day. So a number of different agreements, contracts come into play at this point, and those can include employment contracts, they can include non-disclosure and intellectual property agreements, employee equity agreements, which we'll talk about a little bit more. Then you can get into employee benefit plans and that sort of thing. Very, very important early on, especially among the group of founders, is to have a solid assignment of the intellectual property that's being developed for the company into the company. Pretty straightforward and simple document. And you just want to make sure that everybody around the table who's contributing to the development of the ideas behind the product signs one of these.
We'll touch a little more on intellectual property rights in a later slide, but that can't be emphasized enough that, again, think about your investor. Your investor wants to know the entity owns the IP. By doing it early and by doing it, in employment agreements, you give that investor the assurances that they're investing where the IP is. IP is going to be very important to your company, and so you want to make sure that you have it at the entity level, not at the individual level.
Right. And a piece of this is categorizing employees. First of all, whether or not someone is an employee of the company. Very early on, when founders have started a company, it's a little bit of a gray area because you're typically not receiving a salary, and yet you may feel that you're an employee of the company. You are effectively a founder. But once you're actually hiring and paying people, that's when they technically become your employees. And at that point in time, you need to consider whether they're going to be exempt employees, exempt from the overtime laws, or whether they're going to be non-exempt. And in that case, you need to keep track of hours worked and overtime that's put in. There are employment services that can help you with this process and onboarding employees, but that's key. And then considering whether someone is a consultant as opposed to an employee is also important. And
I think when you're considering consultants, we often recommend a simple consulting agreement that says that they're being hired as a consultant, they're being directed by you, and everything they're doing for you is considered a work for hire. A work for hire is a legal phrase that's used in the intellectual property area that says that every piece of intellectual property that they create is now going to be owned by the entity that hired them. So very important. Again, it goes back to keeping the intellectual property at the entity level.
Yeah, and one misconception that people have often at the beginning of a company is that they come with the expectation that they're going to need employment contracts for each of the founders. You really don't. Employment contracts are typically used when the company is much more developed, has funding, is paying high-level employees. What's much more typical to use is a very simple one-page offer letter that sets forward the terms that you're making an offer to employ the person on, and then a combination of these other agreements addressing IP and that sort of thing. So employment contracts in and of themselves, typically not used early on in a startup. Employee benefit plans, I think it's a nice thing to have. Often startups do not have them for the first 6-12 months of their life. When you are able to obtain them, you're typically starting with the basics, health insurance, that sort of thing. You get to a 401k plan, that's great, but those are typically sort of secondary considerations at the very beginning of a company. And we'll talk a little bit about employee equity agreements. And that's a way to bring in the second tier of employees after the founders who typically have a significant ownership stake in the company. You want to bring in key software programmers or key technology folks, executive level employees to help run the company. they're often going to anticipate or expect an equity stake in the company. And so there are a number of types of equity plans. It depends in the first place as to what type of company you are, whether you're a corporation or whether you're a tax pass-through that is an LLC. So you've got to think about some things there. And then you're typically going to have a pool of equity that gets set aside, bring in new hires. It's often in the 10 to 20% range. You hear 15% quite frequently. And that's equity that gets doled out to the key hires that the company is bringing on board. And it's often subject to a number of restrictions.
Often vesting. So sometimes what you want to do is say, we'll employ you and you'll get 5% of the company, but it's going to be over time. Typically, we see 3 to 4 year vesting as typical for these awards. That means that anywhere from 25% to 33% will be vested after a year. And what that does is you're trying to align the interests of the new hire with the company and with the founders so that everybody has long-term interest in mind. One of the other things to think about is that often some of these awards are annual awards. So employee comes on, gets an option agreement, 3-4 year vesting. Next year, performed well, gets another award, so that you're awarding these to people, but at the same time, they're not all vesting at once, and it keeps everybody's interests aligned.